Okay, in this lecture, I'm going to focus on the dynamics of authority and role. I'm going to speak about both of these. First, authority, and then role. So let's start with thinking about the dynamics of authorization, or also the dynamics of deauthorization. How do we authorize each other, and also sometimes unwittingly, how do we deauthorize each other? So how authorization works is it works from a couple of different levels. We get authorization from top down, down up, peers, and self. Let me explain. So from top down, the authority that I get is the formal authority that I have with my institution and from my boss that says that I am authorized to do a specific task or to fulfill a specific role. In other words, the authority has been delegated to me from someone at the top or someone above me. The organization itself, as well as how the person I report to or my director, how they authorize me. I think it's clear that if that authorization is a bit shaky, let's say you don't have a clear contract, or the person that you report to, instead of really delegating authority to you, they sometimes bypass you and go directly to someone below you. Those are all ways in which your authorization from the top, or your sense of being authorized from the top, can be diminished. So either your contract is vague, or you realize that there are different expectations, or sometimes you start off with a specific formal contract, but then the scope of the contract of what you do, or the scope of the role that you've been employed in, starts to change and starts to include many other things that weren't originally part of the agreement. And in a way, then sometimes you can wonder, but is this really part of my job? Am I really authorized to do this? Or others with whom you are working in your organizational system, they say, hey, but you're not formally authorized to do this specific thing. Why are you doing it? Why should I take your authority serious? So if your authorization from the top is unclear, ambiguous, or sometimes being bypassed, so someone at the top bypasses you, it leaves you with the sense of not being fully authorized from above. The next level is to say, how are we authorized horizontally, so by our peers? If you're sitting around the boardroom table and you speak and make your contributions, and it feels as if your peers are really listening to what you're saying, they are responding to the content of your remarks, they are reflecting on what you're bringing to the table, then it gives you the sense that you are being authorized by those on the same hierarchical level than you are. But on the flip side of that, if that doesn't happen, sometimes people feel that they say something in the boardroom or in a team meeting, they say something, but they're not being taken seriously. Or when they say something, it's not listened to, and then when the very next person says the same thing, that is listened to and that is responded to. That gives one a sense of being deauthorized, and this is a deauthorization that happens on a horizontal level. So the people that are on my level, they don't respond to my authority, or they do. If the people around you respond to your authority, they take you up seriously, then it really gives you a sense of being in the role and being respected in the role. Often there are dynamics, let's say around, it could be many things that are not to do with the work itself, that adds to the effect of deauthorization, either from the top or from peers. For instance, topics that we speak about very often in South Africa, race and gender. So sometimes because of you belonging to a specific race or a specific gender, it feels as if people around the table are not taking you seriously. This also has to do with the pictures that they have in their mind from their previous experiences, the stereotypes that are around us in society, that we sometimes don't scrutinize for ourselves. And then even though we have the best of intentions, we may unconsciously be biased towards a specific person because of their demographics. or sometimes because of the profession that they are from, or because of another organization that they're from. Maybe there's a merger, then someone moves into our organization, but we feel they haven't earned their stripes yet, so we kind of deauthorize them, even though even though it's not consciously done always. So now we spoke about vertical, from top to yourself, your peers, but also you also get authorized by those below you. If the members in your team, if they respond to your requests, to your directives, if they respect the boundaries that are being set between you. Some of those boundaries are just set by yourself. Some of them have been set in negotiation with your team. If it feels like the team responds to your authority, they listen to what you're saying, they're giving their inputs, then you get the sense that you are being authorized from below. But on the contrary, again, if people below you, the ones that report to you, if they don't listen to you, if they don't respond to your requests, if they bypass you and go directly to your superior with certain questions, you start to get the feeling that you are being deauthorized from below. Then the final element is the way in which you authorize yourself. Means the way in which you bring yourself to your role and to the boundaries of your authority. Sometimes we don't take up our roles fully. We don't take up our authority fully. It's as if we are a little bit hesitant or tentative in really filling our space, bringing our whole person into the role in order to really move things. To the extent that we are holding back, to that extent we are in effect deauthorizing ourselves. And sometimes this works in tandem with being deauthorized by your peers or those below you or from those above you. To the extent that you feel that they are not authorizing you, you may feel a bit hesitant to fully take up your authority, but with the concomitant effect that if you don't take your authority fully, it becomes difficult for those alongside you, above you, and below you to fully authorize you, to fully trust that you are the right person for that role, because you're not stepping into your full space, so they might feel you're a bit absent, which may fuel their doubts and their lack of authorization towards you. So you can kind of fall into a spiral of deauthorization that you don't want to be in. Whereas if you fill your role, if you come to the table fully, then no matter what the prejudices may be from those above you, alongside you, and below you, over time they start to see that you are taking this thing seriously, you're bringing your competence to the table, and they can start to relate to you in your role and respect you in your role, and then you start to earn that authorization from those alongside you, those below you, and the one above. I can give another example. If I delegate the task to someone, and they are a bit hesitant in fully taking up that authority, they continuously ask me for my permission, etc., etc. In a way, it tells me, in a way, it makes me feel that, are they really there? Are they really going to take this thing up? And then if I doubt whether they are going to fully take up the role, I may step in to just make sure things happen. But in me stepping in a way, I'm deauthorizing the person as I cross into their boundary of authority. And then again there, we may get this sense of deauthorization. So, so that's the main dynamics of authorization and deauthorization. The way in which we relate to authority has to to a large degree to do with the way in which we've related to or experienced authority from the very start. Your first experience of authority was with parents or early primary caregivers, teachers. None of them have been perfect, as we said earlier. So they made mistakes, and they created a framework within which you started to experience what authority is like and how must you act towards authority in order to get what you want. Maybe you grew up with the idea that authority is always out to get you. Authority is always out to find fault with whatever you were doing. Maybe that's a picture in your mind that has a long history. Uh, and now in your new team, whether you are the one responding to someone else's authority above you, or whether you are relating to the authority given to yourself, this can be very strongly influenced then by those early ideas that I'm not good enough, that there's always something fault, or that authority is out to get me. And then we see how these patterns of how we relate to authority kind of start to repeat themselves throughout their lives. Another example, sometimes people feel they've got to please the authority at all costs. Or sometimes people feel that the authority ought to be rebelled against. And whatever our initial experiences in relation to authority were, and then also subsequent experiences, it's as if they start to build on each other. And all of this starts to create a picture in our mind. The word that we will use in a later lecture is it forms our system in the mind with regards to what authority is, how do I relate to authority, what it means like to be in authority. And all these things work together to tell me in my role how I should be when I am in authority. Sometimes what we do is, if we had let's say, an overly strict parent, and then when we come into authority, due to that, we want to kind of move to the opposite direction, do the opposite of what we've experienced initially. Both of this is still in relation to that system in the mind, saying, I've experienced people being overly strict. That is the last thing that I want to do. I want to be as laid back as possible, as happy-go-lucky as possible. So whenever these mental models, these systems in the mind of how authority works, when we were young, in that situation, with the overbearing or the overly critical or the absent parents, whatever the strategies were that we utilized then to cope with that situation, those strategies aren't necessarily applicable today in your work context. So when we apply a mental model from the past onto our current situation, what we often get is we start to set a self-fulfilling prophecy in place. We act as if the person thinks we can't be trusted, and then because we act in that way, they start to think that we can't be trusted, and they then treat us that way. So we need to be careful of not just copying and pasting. All of this happens unconsciously, of course. Our past experiences and the way in which we've, the defenses, the modes of being in the world that worked in the past. Be careful of how to apply them in the future, because this is not then. So the more you can start to scrutinize your own relation to authority, the more you can start to see patterns of how certain types of conflicts always seem to arise between you and authority. Then think, where does this come from, and how can you change your system in the mind, your assumptions around where you fit into the world and into those in the world that are in charge. If you can start to change those assumptions, you will also change the way in which you relate to the role, and which then can bring transformation. Okay, if we speak about role, we speak about formal role and informal role. Let's first speak about the formal role. The formal role is the formally contracted role that you have with the organization. So that is your job title, your job description, your formal role. You can see that when the formal role isn't defined clearly, if there's a little bit of a question mark regarding what is really part of your job and what's not part of your job, that uncertainty creates some noise in the system. Or if there's a discrepancy between the formal role and your experience or the competency that you have, that causes frustration and a lot of feelings, not only for those around you, but very often for the person themselves. If you are being appointed in a role for which you are not ready, there's a discrepancy between the formal role and what you can actually do. It puts a lot of pressure on the incumbent to try and perform, to overcome anxiety, etc. So what you want, ideally, is that the formal role matches the competency of the person, that the formal role is not redundant, so you're not just creating a formal role for the sake of creating a role for someone. Each formal role must be directly linked to the primary task of the organization. So to the extent that there's not a clear and direct link between the formal role and the primary task of the organization, to the extent that the formal role isn't clearly defined, or to the extent that there's been changes in scope of the role, but these changes haven't been formally circumscribed into the role. All of these things starts to create vagueness, noise in the system, and it means energy that could be used towards work in the system are lost. If we speak about the informal role or the psychological role, we don't refer now anymore to the formal role. We refer to the types of roles that people play or take up in order to assist the system, or to assist the team in its healthy and productive functioning. Our informal roles have to do with where we come from. So you may have a tendency throughout your life to take on a specific informal role. And then the informal roles are, I've got some here: bulldog, critic, the fighter, the enthusiast, the peacemaker. These are all informal roles that we bring to the table. It is possible that in one team I can bring in a specific informal role, and in another team I can act as if I am something else. The team needs these informal roles for its own maintenance and for its own development. What you don't want is you don't want to get stuck in a role, but we'll speak about that a little bit later. So just now to distinguish between the formal role and the informal psychological role. To make sense of this whole concept of the person in role, the role is the overlap between the person and the system. Sometimes we do certain things, we have certain rituals through which to emphasize to ourselves that we are now stepping into another role. So in the picture here, I have a surgeon getting ready to operate on someone. The whole ritual of scrubbing hands, putting on the gloves, putting on the scrubs, the mask, the headgear, all of that also has a psychological function. It starts to program the doctor's mind that they are now stepping into this specific role, and there are specific traits in the doctor's person that are being brought to the fore when stepping into this role. This may be quite different from when the same person steps into another system. Let's say after work, this doctor walks into his house, and then the family is there. And then that system, where that system and the elements of that system, the task of that system, the membership of that system, all of the components making up the family system, the way in which that overlaps with the person will mean that something else will come to the fore. Another part of the person will come to the fore in the role of father or the role of husband. This is something that's quite complicated these days in the working from home situation, where usually in your transition from being the person at home in whatever your home role is, moving from that to your work role, very often entailed getting up at a specific time in the morning, getting dressed, getting into the car, driving to the office, stopping, parking at your parking spot, walking into the space. All of these little things become a ritual that start to prepare you for what your day is about to entail. Now, in working from home, all that happens is you just walk from whatever chaos there was in the living room or in the kitchen or in the kids' rooms, out of that chaos, straight into your study, close the door if you have a door, and into a meeting, immediately into work mode, but with very little of the type of rituals that assists one in moving from the one role to the next. But yeah, the focus here is being able to see that the person is not the role. The role is only a part of the person is being mobilized and utilized in the role. And in the different systems that you are, different parts of the person are being utilized for the purposes of that system, and that is the role. Okay, next slide. is to differentiate between role history and role biography. The role history is the history of a specific role in a specific organization. So let's say this one organization have gone through quite a tumultuous time. The CEO has been replaced or fired 6 times in the last 6 years, and there's a history to that role, about the role, maybe the relationship between the CEO and the organization, expectations from the shareholders of the role of CEO, and when you are then being appointed as the new CEO, you step into a role that has some history in that organization. There's a history of conflicts, expectations, mismatches in expectations, maybe unfair expectations from the shareholders, whatever it may be mindful that whenever you step into a role, the role in which you step into already has a history. Certain things in that organization have become synonymous with that role, has become expected from whoever is in that role. And very often then, people, when they react to you, may react in a way that is incongruent with their expectation of the role as seen in its history, not necessarily in congruence with who you are and what you want to do. But if you are not careful, you may be sucked into playing along these old dramas that started to form the narrative and the story around this specific role in the organization. Your role biography is your story in terms of the roles that you've held until now. Not only the formal roles, but also the informal role. So how you have over time developed a way in which to take up your role. The informal role can often be described as the way in which you take up your role, take up the formal role. And you may have learned certain things throughout your life that started to tell you something about who you are, what you're good at, what you're not good at, what the things are that you need to look out for in order to survive in a system. And all those stories that you've told yourself, maybe also stories that other people has told you, has created in your mind a frame or a picture or a system in the mind regarding your place in the world, how you relate to the world and the role players around you, the systems around you. And all of that also contributes, your role biography also contributes to the way in which you take up your role in a specific moment. And what you don't want is you don't want strategies for survival in role that used to serve a good purpose in the past, based on a context that was real in the past. You don't want to just simply roll those over into the present and act as if all of those things are true where they may not be true in the present. And then that creates misunderstanding of, and also sometimes even, as I said earlier, a self-fulfilling prophecy, where because you act as if certain things are true, they become true because others respond to the way in which you act. You will have read in the theory the word valency, that we have a valency for a role. Another way to describe it is that we attract certain things to ourselves because of who we are, our personalities, the histories that we have with relating to other people, with peers, with people in authority, with people below us. Because of those experiences that we've had in the past, because of our specific preferences, our specific likes and dislikes, we have a certain valency or a certain predisposition to be unconsciously allocated specific informal roles in the team. You will remember on the previous slide, under informal role, we for instance, we had, let's say, the challenger. Let's say one person in the team is always the one that challenges the leader. And that may be something that you have a valency for because of your experience of authority figures earlier on in your life. You may often find yourself that you don't want to be the one to always do the challenging, but before you know it, you are in that role. And it's as if the whole team sits and waits for you to challenge the leader because they don't want to. And then what happens often in the mind of the leader or the manager, you are just being difficult. You are the one who's always challenging. Whereas if only you could resist being pulled into that role every time, it's possible that some others in the team could then take up their part of the responsibility of also challenging what has to be challenged in the team. Otherwise, all of that just becomes one person's role. So if you are the team leader and you see some person is always being utilized in a specific way, you can start to break that pattern by acknowledging what you're observing and then also asking others in the team to also bring up their challenges into the space and show them it's safe. But your valency for the role, another way that some people have described this is that it's like Velcro. Because of your past experiences, certain things tend to stick to you where others don't. And those kind of expectations of what needs to be done in a specific role, those that stick to you are those that you have a valency for. You have a specific attraction to attract specific dynamics and then fulfill a specific role. And then the more you can become aware of the valencies that you have for different roles, the more you are not only a slave to those valencies, but you can start to change them. You can start to make a more conscious decision on reflecting on what you've just done. Maybe you've just stepped into the same trap again. If you can make that speakable and visible, you can make it possible to get out of that and into different roles. So role lock occurs if some person gets locked in a specific role. I used the example of the challenger a little bit earlier. So when one person is kind of locked in the challenger role because of their valency, which is based on their role biography, they've got a certain valency for a specific role, and also because of their early relations with authority, you start to be pulled into a specific type of role. And once you get locked in that role, it's as if the team cannot relate to you in any other way than you being in that specific role, either the critic or the rebel, as if you are always rebellious, or as if you are always the joker, as if you can say nothing serious. If the team starts to act towards you as if you are always in just a specific way, then it means it's possible that role lock has occurred, that you've become locked in a specific role. The downside of that is that, well, first of all, from a team perspective, the downside if individuals in your team get locked in specific roles is that you miss out on various parts of that person that are now not being utilized in your team. There may be more to the joker than always joking. There may be more to the critic than always being critical. And you can't unlock those if someone gets stuck in a specific role. Also, the team starts to become rigid, as if only certain behaviors are allowed by certain people, and you lose some of the flexibility and aliveness and humanness and agility in your team if people start to become locked in roles, especially if these role locks are according to stereotypes. We spoke about racial stereotypes, gender stereotypes, or stereotypes around specific professions that people are in, whether they studied at university or not. We may have these stereotypes, and if we allocate roles according to these stereotypes, and we get people locked in those, it means the stereotypes are being strengthened, and it means the team's ability to think critically about its work, its functions, its malfunctions, its mistakes. The team's ability to think through those things in a flexible way becomes greatly diminished if we only start to think in stereotypical ways. Of course, for the individual themselves, being locked in a role can become a huge burden. People feel underutilized. They feel that certain parts of themselves can't be brought into play because they're always acted towards as if one or two assumptions are true, and they may not be true. So as a team leader, if you start to pick up that someone in your team is being locked in a role. So I once had a client. She was the financial director of her organization. And then in each meeting of the exco, she was also the one who had to take the minutes of the meeting. She was also the only female in the meeting, and she was also the youngest, and she was black. And it turned out that after a while, these stereotypes got to a point where they acted as if the stereotypes justified locking the person in a specific role. And you can see if the financial director is locked in the role of also having to do the minutes or kind of be the secretary for the exco team, first of all, she's being deauthorized. And second of all, there are many parts of her formal and informal role abilities that are not being utilized and taken up by the team. Now, if we link this with what we spoke about in terms of systems, remember we said that systems have boundaries, and that sometimes the boundary around the system is a little bit too tight or too rigid, and it doesn't allow something that's different to come in. So in this case, the boundary around this team may be such that the bringing in of the young black female financial director may be just a little bit too different for that team to tolerate. And then it's as if, but the boundary is crossed, someone is coming into the team, but then they are being kind of sealed off or treated, locked away in a specific role in order to, I think unconsciously, in order to maintain the homeostasis, or what is known and what is stable and what feels safe and secure from the history of the team. The moment they open it up, it opens the team up for transformation and change, new ideas, but also the fear that comes along with change. Because if something changes in one part of the system, it means everything else, including me, in my role, with my prejudices, I also have to do some introspection and change. And we also always have resistance to that kind of change. So as you manage a team, be on the lookout for people being locked in roles, and try to see how you can intervene. Sometimes by making the pattern visible, and making visible that this is not conducive for what we want in the team. Sometimes just by making it visible already gives the input for the pattern to start to change. Another question is around how do you transform your role, especially your informal role. How do you take it up differently? We have referred a little bit before to the system in the mind. So in theory, I can only transform my role to the extent that I'm able to transform my system in the mind, the picture that I carry in my mind regarding how I fit into the world around me and how I can make a contribution. If I've got certain limiting beliefs around what I can do, then these beliefs will also limit the options available to me in terms of how to take up my role. And if I can change these beliefs, I can change up my role differently. If I can change my role, then the system in which I work can also change. So if we think about transformation, I think in South Africa what we've done since 1994, maybe because we are all afraid of change, we've kind of reduced the word transformation to mean something political and to mean some checkboxes and paper exercises in our organizations. Maybe making transformation a pen and paper exercise kind of prevented all of us to really start to work with the deeper dynamics of fear, shame, guilt, rage, whatever those dynamics may be from our past. To the extent that we are not confronting those dynamics, we cannot start to change the picture in our minds that we have of ourselves and of others. And it's only once the picture in our mind can start to change of how do I fit in, how do I relate to someone else, how do they fit in. If that picture in the mind can start to change, I can be liberated to take up my role in my organization, in my team, my family, in my society in a different way, and then systems can start to transform. So in transforming your role as a project manager, if you think about your own role and the limitations that you have and that maybe that you have put on yourself, the importance of being willing to scrutinize yourself, to do introspection, to really reflect on your experiences, that starts to make it possible for you to start to take up your role differently, to the extent that you can realize, you know what, this belief that I'm having, this is not necessarily accurate, and it's not serving me well. I'm going to do something different. Okay, thank you. This is the end.